Please, all of you in the chat, if you have some questions, funnel them in. Also, feel free to wave your virtual hand. As we wait for some of you to do so, I did pick out some questions from the chat while you presented, Busi. First is from Inat. Inat asks, why is corruption defined as public enemy #1 for developing world only? It looks like corruption in the developed world, I suppose, is overlooked. He didn't finish, or he or she, I'm not sure, didn't finish their comment. But can you speak to that? Why is corruption defined as public enemy #1 for the developing world only, and not the West or global North?
Absolutely. I mean, this is, it is clear, right? The political agenda, but not just that, but it's also always in comparison. It's this idea that the developing South, if there was no corruption, would somehow be more developed, you know, without acknowledging that the developing North is developed precisely from the violent extraction of the global South to begin with, right? So it's comparing it to this idea that corruption is hindering development, but it's actually not corruption that's necessarily hindering development. Like, we are talking about hundreds of years of just like, you know, exploitative capitalistic extraction, which a lot of global North countries benefited from. So even though there's corruption in the North, it is not, you know, we can't, it's harder to say this child in London is not going to school because of corruption. You know, but on the African continent, you can say this child is not going to school because the government is corrupt. So it's just, yeah, the context really.
It's about the context, excuse me, it's about the context. Inat appears to be a lady and has raised her virtual hand. So I'm going to welcome her to unmute and go ahead and share before we take on more points.
Okay, good evening, everyone. I'm calling from London, and it's lovely to be a part of this group. It's my first time, and I'm enjoying the presentation. Actually, sorry, I sent a message and then I sent another one. I entered it by mistake. But basically, what I wanted to say is, for me, corruption is wrong, whether in the developing country or developed country. And we very well know how much the developed world is corrupted, but it uses it and do it in a smart way that it just doesn't look like corruption. You know, you look at the very top. I mean, the whole notion of per capita. What does that mean? It's like the few millionaires and billionaires and trillionaires, you know, divide their income by the number of population, as if everyone is living a good life or above average, when actually, in fact, in the Western world, there are millions of people going through poverty, actually what can be defined as poverty, living in America, living in Europe, except that Europe is a little bit better because the government does a lot of social welfare. So for me, corruption is wrong, whether Africa or developing countries or developed countries. But also, I originally come from Ethiopia, and a lot of the, not a lot, all the corruptions are facilitated by the Western world. There are banks in the Western world, the money goes out in the Western world, every single thing is linked to the Western world. So for me, I think we have to somehow find this definition of corruption and all the rest of it within the African context, because it's just not working for me. That's my comment.
Absolutely, I agree with you there. And I think, you know, it's that thing. It's this, you know, to me, it's the political inequality or policy inequality, right? That says that, you know, in the developed world is that we will provide all the social protection, we will provide all of these things. But on the African continent, you can't afford it. Always. We can't afford it. We don't have the finances to afford it. And so in that regard, right, it's corrupt, you know, corruption becomes even more evident, because it's not just that, and when I go through the South Africa slides, you'll see is that not only do we have shrinking government spending, but in addition to that, then there's also the corruption element. And of course, corruption is a share of government spending. As spending decreases, it's obviously not going to get less, right? So then corruption becomes more. as a proportion of sort of what's happening. And so these things are always, intersecting in various ways. It's not just corruption, it's understanding corruption, like I said, in the political economy context, it's understanding the political powers that may be. But fundamentally, I think it's identifying what kind of corruption are we seeing in our countries, right? If we're to go and break this down, like the list I've given you of the types of corruption, and you're to go and sit down and say, actually, in my country, the biggest issue is, I don't know, maybe you might say it's predatory, it's theft. The systems work, right? There's systems and the laws are clear. But what's happening is that officials are asking for money and so forth. And there's a lot of great studies, for example, that show that increasing, for example, public sector wages does not reduce corruption, right? Because people assume sometimes that people are corrupt because they want more money. But some studies have shown that actually increasing wages doesn't reduce corruption. And so this is where we have to think deeper and more nuanced. What is driving this kind of corruption, right? What are the compulsions and why does it continue? How does it, the fundamental question to me always about all economic policy and questions is, how is the thing reproducing itself? How is it reproducing itself? Over time, over space, over gender, race, class? Why is corruption reproducing itself? And this is very context-specific answer, always.
Thank you very much for that answer, Busi. We have another hand up before we continue. Baba, please feel free to unmute yourself.
Thank you very much, Nega. Well, for me, first, thanks for that presentation, Busi, and I liked your reference to Mushtaq's work in looking at Bangladesh and beyond anyway. Well, for me, two things really. One, Mushtaq's thesis shows how corruption played, was an element in developmental processes in Southeast Asia and some other. But beyond that also is the fact that I think it's not just about that. I mean, is there corruption in the north with the wealthier countries and in Africa? Corruption is endemic in capitalism. It's impossible to I mean, it's so you could talk about how and why does it play different roles within different contexts, and that also takes me to the one thing well, if we look at things just narrowly with regards to the now, the position that crisis always leads to neoliberalization might hold water. But looking at the longevity of history itself, and I'm talking about even just last century, a crisis led to the post-World War II order, I mean, with the developmental states in the global south, the welfare states in the advanced capitalist countries, and so on and so forth. And one of, I had a debate within one of the APOD programs then with Amsden's perspective that it was just about the main difference between the rest and the remainder was about education, knowledge, but it was much more than that. It was that if you look at it closely, those that rose, became newly independent, newly industrialized countries, they could tap into the consensus, the global consensus at that period, because they had at least formal sovereignty. Africa, it wasn't until towards the end, the twilight of that of the golden age of capitalism, and this is significant. Why is this significant? Coming back to the question, to the issue of that crisis does not necessarily have to be that it leads to neoliberalization. The crisis, the organic crisis that ended with World War II, and I mean with the global depression before then, it brought something else. And why? It was because those fighting, challenging capitalism at that point in its, at that period of its crisis, we are demanding for a post-capitalist future. They were demanding for a post-capital. We cannot get corruption reduced, except we fight for much more than just reforms. You know, that's my view. As I said, I usually say that, look, it's like you are in hell and you're trying to negotiate with the devil for a cooler place in hell. The devil realizes you are not serious. You're not, but if you fight like hell to get out of hell, even if you don't get out, the devil will try to reach a deal with you to have air conditioning or something like that in your corner. So I think that, I mean, to challenge corruption, to challenge, we need to dream dreams and have visions with our feet on the ground for a post-capitalist future for Africa and for the world as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you for those insights. Thank you so much for that. You've got a round of applause from our director, Nigel. Busi's been nodding her head. I think everybody nodded their head when you mentioned that this is endemic in capitalism. Busi, as you reply to that and prepare to continue with your presentation, please do consider Nigel's question. Is a post-capitalist future communism, socialism, what?
Cool. Okay, so I'll start and just reply to those comments. I think absolutely, I agree with you that corruption is endemic in capitalism. I think there's certainly more research. Like I said, I think corruption is probably a feature of all times, right? Regardless of structure. The question is, to what extent does corruption become central to the reproduction of the system itself? And I absolutely agree with you that corruption is fundamental in reproducing the capitalistic system itself. I think the reason why I'm arguing that crisis entrenches neoliberalism further is because what you see since the 70s, every time there's a crisis, there's a global consensus in theory, but really there's two types of consensus. There's one for the global north and one for the global south, continuously, consistently. After the financial crisis, what happens? We see stimulus and then austerity in a lot of countries, and we see austerity in a lot of African countries to begin with, right? And right now in this current crisis, we're seeing the IMF saying to governments, do not pursue a budget surplus. What you should actually do is let debt to GDP ratios decline as growth recovers, right? But at the same time, this is the same IMF that has 94 austerity programs lined up for developing countries, right? So there is the separation of what the message is globally, in theory, and the separation of what is really happening to countries. And so you'll see that a lot of countries have had to reintroduce these IMF conditionalities because of the trade shocks, right? We are all experiencing, or the global economies experience, unusual supply and demand shocks. And so the terms of trade for African countries is really poor to begin with because of this export-oriented dependency, right? Commodity export-oriented dependency. And so many countries, what are they going to do? They're going to go borrow money from the IMF in exchange for an IMF program or World Bank. What will the World Bank and the IMF say? We've changed our tune. Of course, we are saying governments mustn't implement austerity. But when you look at the terms of agreement, what you will see is austerity, right? And what does austerity do? Austerity, and I'm going to try find, I wrote about this. I'm going to try find the quote from the paper I wrote about austerity. But it's basically arguing that austerity is a tenet of neoliberalism. It re-entrenches it. And what austerity does is reconfigure, markets in the interests of capitalism, right? So it comes at a time where it says, we need to cut back on government involvement in the state. Austerity in South Africa currently is you're seeing state-owned entities being sold. You are seeing budget cuts, right? And what does budget cuts mean in terms of public service provisioning? It's the assumption that government is crowding out investment. So government must cut back so that private sector can come forward. And of course, business endorses this idea. Government, you're spending too much. Don't spend too much. How about we have public-private partnerships where you basically absorb all the risk for us? We get the money, you absorb the risk, everybody's happy, you know? So in a way, I think austerity really entrenches neoliberalism in a very particular way. And I'll try to find that quote if I get the chance, but to say that that is the key critical concern. How do we challenge power at a global level? And I think if we are in 2021, you know, well into COVID, and these narratives haven't been sufficiently challenged, we are already seeing austerity on the horizon. Hey, South Africa is already within austerity. Never mind, we're seeing austerity on the horizon. South Africa is already within austerity. And South Africa, I'd argue, is one of the countries that is able to actually push its sovereignty, because our fiscus itself has the capabilities and capacities to be able to push this different kind of policy agenda. But when a country like South Africa is not, then you have to ask yourself, what are the compulsions? What are the power dynamics and compulsions that are leading to the continuous entrenchment of this, you know? And of course, there's many ways. We talk about this a lot. We talk about even the way economics is taught itself is one of the ways that the system reproduces itself. Critical. If you go to a South African university, anyway, actually on the African continent, you go to a university, what are they teaching people in economics? Supply demand curves, you know, we've all been through that, economics 101. What are they teaching people about crisis? How is the, you know, and this is a critical question, how is the curriculum changed in the context of this crisis? And you'll find that the same materials being taught still. And so that's the difficulty. I mean, I don't have the answers to say, you know, how do we challenge power? I don't know. I mean, I try to challenge power in South Africa every day, and I'm not winning. I can testify to that. But how do we challenge the hegemony at a global scale and in a solidified way? Because I think it's obviously not one country, it's about, you know, a group of countries. How do you reach that fiscal, I'm seeing there civil society, I work in civil society, Nigel, and I can tell you we're all on the same page about how austerity must go, but National Treasury is telling us no, and they're the ones in charge. And it's actually funny in South Africa because it's not just civil society, it is government departments themselves saying no. It's everybody saying no, but somehow the political settlement is such that the National Treasury holds a particular power. And the question we ask ourselves all the time is, how do we dismantle that power? How do we challenge that power? I work with labor unions every single day, and even labor unions are not winning on this front. It's mass mobilization. I mean, I work with unions, 2 million representative union, 2 million people, yet it's still not winning. And so, yeah, these are tough questions. I wish I had answers to them, but it's really challenging to challenge that power. And in terms of what is the future, I don't know. That's a very difficult question. I've always shied away from considering myself, you know, a Marxist or a communist or whatever. Yeah, I don't know. I'm interested in how do I win the now. I'm more concerned about that. But I certainly think that I would say that I do find myself more biased towards Marxist, feminist Marxist political economy analysis, and sort of envisioning a future through that lens.
I think we're on the same page there, Busi. Thank you so much for all of those insightful comments and Busi, your answers. I'd like to invite you to continue with your presentation just in the interest of time.
Yes, and now I seem to have lost my presentation. Hold on.
Okay, no problem.
I don't know what happened there.
While Busi goes and finds this, I will let the audience know that she actively campaigns against austerity, so much so that her Twitter username is Busi Anti-Austerity Sibeko.
It is and I actively fight with my finance ministers on public forums. So that's also the other thing that happens a lot. Anyway, okay, so I think I found my slides. There you go. So here we've started sort of talking about this. And as I said before, fiscal policy is sort of the area that I work in most. And we started talking about austerity. And of course, what are the dangers of corruption? We know this is that resources are being transferred from potentially productive investments to unproductive investments. We've already spoken about the offshoring of wealth, of national wealth and resources, damaging state interventions. And there's many examples of this, particularly, I mean, in any country, I think we all have an example of where something was meant to be done and wasn't because of corruption, or where something was meant to be finished and is half finished or never began because of austerity. And then, reducing, in property rights in particular are very critical in a lot of African countries. As we know, a lot of us, I mean, in South Africa, we don't have title deeds. And so that is a critical issue still to this day, and a lot of countries too, who owns what, and how do they gain access to that, given, like I said, the violent land grabs that took place with, for example, the establishment of capitalism itself, poor policy investments in public infrastructure, and investors and so forth, we know that. And the state has become viewed as predatory. So there's also how the state is perceived, and is seen as engaged. For example, if you implemented a stimulus, which is one thing that I've been arguing for in South Africa since 2019, is that people will say, well, even if you have a stimulus, it will not be used properly. So it will not, benefit the South African economy. And there's deep public distrust. So even if the state were to say, yes, Busi, you're right, we need a stimulus to change our economy, people will say, we don't trust the state, like not to eat this money, But also I think what I've been reflecting on a lot is that sometimes issues like this, like corruption in particular, lead to resistance against progressive policies. And what do I mean by this? It means, for example, we can argue, and let's say I'm going to give the stimulus example again. I can argue for increased spending on healthcare in South Africa. But the pushback will always be, but government is not spending the money the way it should be. So even though the increase of expenditure on health is much needed, right? The public healthcare system in South Africa delivers to 84% of the population, while the private sector is about 16% of the population. But believe it or not, these two sectors, the one that benefits 16% and the other one, spend the same amount of money. They both spend about 4% of GDP, right? And tell me, I mean, we all can see this, right? How can you spend the same amount on 16 people as you do on 84 people? It doesn't make sense, right? And so even if I said increase this for the majority, people, they'll push back and say that there's corruption, therefore the progressive policy falls through. Not because the policy wasn't necessarily itself good, but because the public distrust plays a role in this, but also it exacerbates the resistance, which is already there. We know, for example, business is going to resist anyway, because business is going to say the government is spending too much. So the more people resist, the less likely that it is that the policy pulls through. And also importantly, corruption, like many other economic policies, don't have neutral effects or impacts on society. So it is always important that we understand how corruption plays out through the existing structural inequalities in our economies, which is race, gender, geography, among other intersecting identities. One of the things, for example, I talk about a lot is debt. Who shoulders the cost of debt? And when public services, for example, are in decline, what happens is that the work that those public services are supposed to be doing get reallocated to households. And women and children, women and girls in particular, bear the burden of that social productive work. And what do I mean by that? For example, hospitals in South Africa were full, ICUs were full. Guess what? People had to be at home, and guess who was doing the unpaid care work of taking care of the sick, the elderly? So there are real costs that are shouldered by people with gender, with sexuality across different lines, and we have to understand that it is not neutral. And I think the biggest problem in economics is the assumption of aggregates, the assumption that everyone is impacted the same way. So if we just make this policy, all men and women will be employed equally and it'll all be great. But that's not how it works, right? It's good to understand capitalism and how itself is structured and the intersection with households. So I think, corruption is really a threat in those particular ways, and particularly to social reproduction, and to give a proper definition to say that social reproduction is the work that is needed for society to continue, right? To maintain our needs, to maintain our existence. It's the work that is required. It's not work that we like to do. Nobody likes to do it. But there's work I do every single day to socially reproduce myself. We all do the work every day. We cook, we clean, we go to work, whatever. But to say that some of these things like corruption, which take away basic services, which are fundamental to our social production, right? You need a public clinic when you're sick because you can't afford a private sector hospital. It takes that away in a way. And so here's what I wanted to show you about South Africa, about how corruption exacerbates this. So in South Africa, there's this whole narrative that there's no austerity because expenditure has grown a lot. Like, okay, we'll look there from 2015, 16. Okay, you see there, that's the expenditure and that's the revenue. And so our finance minister has continuously said, we need to close the hippo's mouth. This is the hippo's mouth, by the way. And so our finance minister says this a lot. But one thing I always try to point people to is to say that, yes, the total budget looks like the expenditure is increasing, but what's happening here? This is the budget you should be looking at. Non-interest spending is spent on everything but debt. So the fastest growing item on our budget is actually debt. So our government is trying to convince us that because they're spending more on debt, they're spending more on us, which go figure is not the case, right? And so here you see what's happening with non-interest spending, which is spending on education, health, in all the critical departments. And so here you see that the revenue, right, the non-interest spending, there you go, is actually, has been not as high as we can see here on the left, right? So even when revenue, like look here, main budget revenue, even when revenue peaked, look what happened here to spending. It didn't peak with it, even though South Africa has got a commitment. We've got the constitution, which is supposed to progressively realize people's rights, across all, rights, education, health, and so forth. And so you can only imagine what corruption is doing. And the reason why I'm showing you this is to say, look at what's happening to non-interest expenditure, and now imagine corruption in addition to what is happening in the context, in addition to it, right? And of course, South Africa's always had the crisis before the crisis of social reproduction, the crisis of the Black working class, which is largely poor and Black and women. We've always had these deep inequalities. And so public expenditure is critical to our nation, right? It's critical, and I'd argue that government expenditure is critical everywhere in the developing world. But to say, in a country where you've got such high inequality, we've got such high unemployment, such high poverty, cutting government expenditure is really detrimental to those who rely on government services for survival. And of course, corruption has exacerbated these conditions, And so, but here, as I said, our government will be implementing austerity despite their favorite IMF saying there should be no austerity. So over the next few years in South Africa, what's happening is that what South Africa was spending, or what South Africa will be spending on us in 2022-23 is actually lower in real terms than what they were spending on their citizens per citizen in 2012. So over the next 3 years, you see a rapid cut in budget, estimated at about 265 billion rand over the next 3 years to be cut from the budget. And so when you look at municipalities, you're going to see, for example, a reduction in how much money municipalities are getting. And of course, most people would argue that municipalities is where corruption is happening. So what happens when this purse is shrinking? Like I said, corruption is not going to shrink as the purse shrinks, it's not going to work that way. And to say that we're really going to see crisis levels, particularly on the ground, and municipalities are on the ground. They're the first front for basic service provisioning. And so to say that this is why we care about austerity, not austerity, corruption and austerity and intervention. So even though we're in a healthcare crisis, the budget cuts, I think I didn't put the number here, but 50.3 billion over the next 3 years will be cut from the healthcare budget. In education, and look what our government says to us. They say that they recognize that cutting the budget for health will reduce the number of available teachers. This, coupled with the rising number of learners, implies larger class sizes, especially in no-fee paying schools. And this is the poorest of the poor in South Africa, which is expected to negatively affect learning outcomes. So clearly, we don't care about the educational outcomes of poor South Africans. And at the same time, I mean, hey, we don't care what the municipalities will be doing with the smaller budget, but also not even taking into account the effects of corruption that are even taking place.
Let me know what they say. We'll take it from down and from there. Thanks, I appreciate it. Thank you. Emigrate solo, it's not easy.
My apologies for that. All of you are please reminded to keep your microphones on mute unless you're called on to speak. Thank you.
Yes, I was done with that section, so it worked out.
Okay, well, we'll take that. We've got thumbs up from Baba, so thank you for that. Let us just see. Do we have any direct questions on that section?
I see why can't we tax the top 5%?
Do you have an answer for that, Busi?
Nigel, Nigel, you know how many tax submissions are right? And you know how many tax submissions are saying that we must introduce a net wealth tax in South Africa? And how many things are saying, in addition to a net wealth tax, we need to implement capital control? Because people say, if you tax the wealthy, they'll leave. And I say, we need capital controls, net wealth tax. And in addition to all of this, it's not just about taxing the individuals. One of the things I've put forward is, and I'll try to share all these things when we close out. But one of the things I've said is that we need a resource rent tax in South Africa. What does that mean? It means that when companies reach a certain profit during a commodity boom, we need to be taxing them for the additional profits that they're making, because it is national wealth. You know, can't be that Anglo-America is making big money from South Africa. And in addition to that, they're not increasing the workers' wages sufficiently. So they can't even justify why they must keep this money. You know, and so one of the other things, and there's many taxes. Recently, one of the new ideas we've got is a social solidarity tax. We've also introduced or also proposed a social security tax. And all these taxes are really around what we've been arguing for universal basic income grant in South Africa, given the high levels of unemployment and poverty and so forth. And so the tax, and that's what I said again, like it goes back to this question of, I'm convinced that no matter how much research evidence you provide, you can crunch the numbers, you can tell National Treasury, I've calculated this is how much more we can be getting for you to provide this policy or implement this policy. There is always pushback of sorts. I mean, you know, the other day I was calling National Treasury out for citing documents from 2008. I mean, that was pre-financial crisis. Please, how are you still using policies from 2008? But apparently, you know, like I don't have the power to move it. And so we've been putting this forward. Like there was a tax commission in South Africa, the Dennis Davis Tax Commission, and all these issues were discussed of where particular tax reforms could be made and what did they decide to increase VAT, which disproportionately impacts the poor. So yeah, I don't know what it will take. I don't know what kind of research. I think it will have to be God himself must come and give them the research evidence. Because
force majeure.
I'm not God.
Force majeure. I think
I'm not God.
I think this tells us where the real problem is and where real power lies, actually. And the heart of the problem is actually the structure of our world itself, you know, and the game that we're not playing behind the curtain that I guess is hidden from all of us. I think that's the way I feel about it. And we got to open that curtain and get to the heart of where people are doing things that people don't see.
That's true. Omar just commented, we will never achieve the outcomes we desire within a system that is not designed to deliver such an outcome. So it calls for some sort of overhaul. And this is in agreement with, you know, Baba's comments earlier as well. Busi is sharing in some hot links in the chat. Busi, do you want to let us know what those are real quick?
Yeah, it's just some of the, so the two things I've shared so far are the papers I've written on austerity and the proposal for fiscal stimulus for South Africa. And then I'm going to just share the tax proposal that we've recently written. And I think, I mean, they're useful for anyone who is interested in sort of like for their own country or a different place, thinking about what kind of tax resources to think about. But I absolutely agree with that comment to say that we'll never win within the, yeah, you know, it's the difference between being a capitalism reformist and being anti-capitalist, right? And to say that one of the key arguments we've always made is to say that the neoliberal policies in South Africa will not deliver on the constitutional framework that South Africa has written for itself. By design, it will not. You know, I always say this, capitalism thrives on inequality, right? It was even Marx himself who said that unemployment is a function of capitalism, right? It's a force in its wage. Lower wages for those who are, you know, participating in the labor market, but also, I mean, we're compelled to work anyway. But besides that, there will always be a reserve army of labor. It's a function of capitalism. And in South Africa, you see it very clearly. But also not that, one of the questions, you know, I've been asking is, what happens when capitalism is no longer interested in labor? And I think we're going to increasingly see this, there's 4IR take place and so forth. And how do we think about capitalism then because capitalism traditionally and historically has thrived on labor. And so and it's not to say that capitalism will never need labor again, but to say when there's a reduced demand significantly over time, what will this mean? You know, and yeah, I don't have the answer to that, but how do we think about that?
That's some really good further thinking.
So I gave you a monster question.
Yeah, I'm about to read this question out loud, but Nigel goes and types, I wonder if Busi was economics minister to Thomas Sankara, what would be her economic plan for Upper Volta?
First of all, I mean, way too young to have been in that era. So importantly, so that's the first thing. But secondly, yeah, and I think I don't really have an answer, and the reason is because and to my, you know, it's really a weakness is that as much as I work in the space, a lot of work we've done. So the most recent work that I've done that is Pan-African, it's sort of a Pan-African pro-employment macroeconomic framework, which will be published by the ILO eventually soon. But even that, it is not prescriptive in a sense that it doesn't say, here's a one-size-fits-all for every African country to implement and everybody will be successful. So I don't know the nuances in the detail to be able to give sort of that detailed answer. But even within that, saying that, one of the things we've been thinking about in our institution, because we've got a lot of work, we work on just transition. What does it look like to transition from coal to like green energy, climate just energy? There's one wing of our work. We work on feminist economics, unpaid care work, radically redistributing, you know, unpaid and paid care work and so forth. We work on budget, we work on infrastructure, we work on various topics. And one of the questions we've been asking ourselves is, how do we comprehensively think holistically about these policies? How do we think about macroeconomic, sectoral, social, labor policies? And what is a comprehensive economic framework for South Africa? And that is, you know, it's a very difficult question to answer. Yeah, like how do we view all of these things? But also it requires many people. We all have our different specialties, even within the team, right? We're talking about 20 people all coming with their expertise and saying, this is how I see this fitting into the broader, you know, structural transformation. And when I say structural transformation, I'm not talking about just from less productive to productive. When I say structural transformation, I'm talking about social, economic, you know, transformations, which include social and productive work as part of it. And so, yeah, so unfortunately, I don't have an answer. I wouldn't have a comprehensive answer for you. I wish I could sit and say, in terms of fiscal, this is what you do. In terms of monetary policy, this is what you could do. Sectoral, you know, I wish I could sit there and do that, but I can't.
Your answer, Busi, is also an answer to a question asked by Pauline earlier. So it helps us there, because she did ask, what economic paradigm can African countries create to protect their resources for their people, and eliminate the wealth gap in Africa, as well as stopping brain drain and control of the multinationals. So I think that really does speak to that. And another question that we have, which is the reason why Sankara came up in the chat a little earlier, actually, was a question from, I think it was Freddie, who asks, are there any instances of countries which have been able to successfully avoid the double-edged medicine which the IMF and the World Bank have been providing? It's that definition of insanity, he says, doing the same thing and expecting a different outcome. African states have to find an alternative model, he says. Well, what do you think about that?
Absolutely. I mean, I couldn't agree with more. I mean, it's literally like, there's so much content I could, I like hearing these things because it reaffirms what I've been saying. I mean, one of the op-eds I wrote was, South Africa cannot continue to do the same and expect a different outcome. Like, it's just madness, right? You can't expect neoliberal policies to have socialist outcomes. And that's what's been happening. We're implementing liberal capitalism and hoping, socialism will emerge from it. It doesn't work. South Africa is supposed to be a democratic socialist state. And all I can describe South Africa as is orthodox economics with some rays of progressivity. And those some rays of progressiveness emerge because of a response to the failures of the dominant thinking anyway. They're not progressive because it's genuinely like we genuinely wanted a progressive state. It's like, oh my gosh, we are failing. We need to do something to like ensure that we don't do worse. And so absolutely agree. I think there are some, I just read a case study on Barbados. And it's interesting to me because they were implementing a program, and I think it's an IMF program from 2018. But what was interesting is the focus on social protection in that program, And I was very shocked because I was like, oh my gosh, how did Barbados manage to, through an IMF program, implement a minimum wage and implement social protection? Like, what did they do? I need their notes. Like, how can everybody do that? Because it's a different type of policy trajectory, but then at the same time, without underestimating the other policies, because you always have to look at the net effect of all the policies. Like, it could be that a minimum wage is established, but then the minimum wage is actually ineffective because it's not even a minimum wage to begin with. People can't live on it, and it's just a tokenistic trade-off. Or, you have social protection, but it's just social protection to keep capitalism alive, right? Because I mean, if most of the population is poor and can't reproduce itself, then you won't have labor, and then capitalism can't function without labor anyway. So it's always important to be critical of even some of these progressive policies we might win, and to really understand, like, as much as they win, but to understand what other policies we need to champion, and potentially why those particular policies have won. Because again, I mean, these capitalists will always give us piecemeal. They'll never give us the whole thing on the platter.
That's true. I would like to know as well what Barbados did. So if you find out and have full notes on that, please tell me. Chege has
it's a
had
developing study.
Yeah. Okay,
Developing
we'll look
study.
to that. If you got a link to that as well, please do share in the chat. Freddie says the Prime Minister of Barbados is a rising star. Nigel says Hillary Beckles will have been behind that, I'm sure. Would like to know. Chege Mwangi, please feel free to unmute yourself and share.
Yeah, hello, I hope you can hear me.
We can hear you loud and clear, sir.
Yeah, okay, so lovely presentation, Busi. Thank you so much for a lot of insight there. I'm not in the field of economics, but I'm very much interested in what's happening, of course, in my world, that's Africa. And the first thing is that I have a problem with the word independence. When we talk about Africa gaining independence, I have a problem with that because Africa had been very self-sustaining before the colonialists came in. So we didn't get independence from them. We actually asked them to leave most of the time, probably violently, particularly in my country. So the notion of independence is probably Western-based, And I think, I personally think we should avoid using it as much as possible, if possible. Anyway, the area I just been thinking about, which is probably a continuation of what we had last week, is yes, we've heard about the problems and the issues that are there, but what next? Yeah, what next? We can have these papers, we can have these presentations, and we can have them again and again over the years. And I'm sure most of the political leaders in Africa and the governance leaders in Africa knows about this. But then what we do, I always feel that Africa has been put on a leash by the West, and it's told where to go, when. And sadly, we have obliged. Once in a while, we probably thrown in a bone to chew when we make a bit of noise, and keep us busy as our gold and our diamond is being stolen from us. We've been kept busy, and the problem is that the systems we have of governance in Africa are Western driven, they're Western motivated. They came, they left the systems to us and for us, and we think that we had the independence, as we have said before, but actually, no, they just use the front door to leave, but they left the door open, and they can come anytime and take our stuff and go. So I think the issue is ourselves as Africans to see what do we do about this. We need to change the narrative about the governments we have. We've been called corrupt. We know we are not any more corrupt than they are, but then that sticks. And as much as it sticks, then they will continue to use it. I think it's important to realize that that the West is never our friend. And when we go to them and tell them to change things, we actually give them the power. We're telling them, you have the power to change things, you do change things for us. We should take the power, we should change things for ourselves. I think is what people have been talking about in terms of running our own financial systems, what I probably personally will call agroeconomics, Afroeconomics. So African-based economies of systems of governance, so that Africa can start taking charge of her affair. If every time things go wrong and we go to the West and tell them to change things, they're going to tweak a few things. They're going to, if they are stealing from the front door, they lock the door from the front, but they'll go to the back and steal from the back. And then if you complain about that, they'll say, okay, fine, we will change things, and they'll get through the window. So they have ways of getting through to us. We just need to take charge of our systems. And I know it's difficult to start somewhere, but we must start somewhere so that our generations to come can progress this. And then one day, hopefully one day, Africa will be free. Thank you.
My apologies for that, guys. Sorry, some sound issues here. A lot of sense being talked there by Cheke, so thank you for that input. George in the chat says, fully agree, as I'm sure most of us do. Busi, your thoughts on that before you continue?
Yeah, I mean, I agree, right? It's that, it's, when we think about independence, and when we think about liberation, have we achieved it? Probably not, right? In South Africa, have we achieved political liberation? Potentially, because we can vote, but it doesn't mean it's full liberation. And I mean, even Nelson Mandela himself said that, what is liberation without economic liberation, but a shadow of itself, right? So acknowledging that, it's a multi-package thing, right? It's not just about your ability to vote only. It is these many facets that need to be transcended. But like many things, we go from austerity to neo-austerity, from classical economics to neoclassical. Then we go from, we are in a lot of the literature around Africa talks about colonial and in a neo-colonial state, right? So the state, which is the colonial powers, still have power, and it might be, indirect quote, like through the World Bank and the IMF, or it might be direct where, like Frank or former French colonized states, where the French are very directly in contact, like for example, like some countries do not necessarily still hold that like direct relationship to the colonial you know, and I don't want to call them masters, like the colonial criminals. I don't know, we need to find a new word. The colonial criminals, you know, and so it's, you know, we are, I agree, in a stage of neocolonialism. And I think in terms of structures, and I get, you know, that question is always interesting to me, because I think fundamentally it's about what structures do we identify to be working? I think sometimes there's this sense that everything is failing, and I don't think that's true. Even when I look around, like on the South African front, and I look at which institutions are doing well, you know, and then we need to find those institutions and say, how do we replicate this? What is it that's making this one institute? Is it your tax revenue service? You know, these tax revenue services, they really want their money. Is it them? Are they doing well? And why are they doing well? You know, like, and it's identifying which institution, which even within a large institution, which department, which people are doing well, and how to reproduce this. The AU is not doing well, also because it's part funded by all these new, you know, colonial masters, you know, but are there other structures of Pan-African solidarity, whether formal or informal, that are working well? And how do we replicate those is some of the things, because I do think some of these answers already exist. And it's about knowing, and unfortunately, it's like sometimes it's hard to come by this information or understand, but or this understanding, but we have to find them and seek them out and replicate them because they exist.
Thank you very much for that, Busi.